Well, welcome back, everyone. After intervening week, we are here for day 5 now of the South Tacoma Neighborhood Council, 350 Tacoma versus the City of Tacoma through its Planning and Development Services Department. Appeal of a determination of mitigated non-significance and issuance of a critical areas development permit. It is 9 o'clock, and so we are convened and on the record with the recording going. My recollection, and I think I'm pretty clear on that because I went back and checked the video from last Friday, we were just rounding maybe third base on the direct examination of Kevin Warner from Landau Associates and ran out of time with that. So I presume that's where we're going to pick up. With the direct examination of Mr. Warner, and then we will move to cross and hope we can get things finished up today, but I guess we'll see. Given the intervening time, I'm going to go ahead and swear you in again, Mr. Warner. Not that, that necessarily wears off or fades away or any of that kind of thing, but, I guess just for good form with an intervening week and all of that. So let's go ahead and swear you in again to finish your testimony. So do you swear and affirm that the testimony you are going to complete here for us today as part of this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth under penalty of perjury?
I do.
All right. So Ms. Kaler, I presume you're going to finish up with that?
That is correct. Good morning, Mr. Warner.
Good morning.
So as you may recall, when we last met, you described your noise study, and I believe we had begun to discuss Dr. D'Souza's testimony. So I'd like to pick up there where we left off and continue. I have a few more questions for you about Dr. D'Souza's testimony and her analysis. First, did you hear her comments on your report?
I did.
All right, so there's a few things I'd like to ask you about her testimony about your report and ask you to respond to. First, did you hear her testimony that your report was difficult to replicate?
Yes, I did.
And can you respond?
Certainly. So our report was based on an assessment of noise modeling, not spreadsheet calculations. So we used a three-dimensional noise model called CADNA-A, developed by Data Acoustic. And the appellant's calculations were just that, spreadsheet calculations. So my assumption is that they did not have the model available to do their own study.
Thank you. Did you hear her testimony that your study did not provide the distances from receptors or noise sources?
I did.
And can you respond?
Sure. So our study did not have a table that identified the distances, but as I stated earlier, we prepared the model based on drawings provided by Bridge on parcel data available by the county, and we populated receptors along those property lines of the nearest homes. We call them receptors in the model, and the sources were inside the property where we would anticipate they would be, and so the distance from each receptor to the varying sources is going to be different for each source. And so the model was prepared accurately, and to illustrate the locations, we created a figure that's in our report that illustrates where those receptors are located, and their georeference or the base map underneath it, so you can see where they actually are and where some of the noise sources actually were.
Thank you, Mr. Warner. And I'm not going to pull that up, but just for the record, that was figure 2 of exhibit B18. Did you hear her testimony, Dr. D'Souza's testimony, that your study did not look at the 1.5 minute or hourly thresholds?
Yes, I did.
And can you respond?
Sure. So I assume that Dr. D'Souza was talking about the WAC thresholds. And when I say WAC in this context, I'm referring to the Washington Administrative Code, Chapter 17360, which has those specific limits. I talked last time about the base limits and then the allowed exceedances of those limits for specific durations of time. So I think the 1.5 minute, which you might have been referring to, was a sound level that can be exceeded for 1.5 minutes of an hour. And so I think there was a bit of a misunderstanding in terms of Dr. D'Souza's interpretation of the WAC limits and how we would evaluate them against sources of noise that continue over the course of an hour that we might expect, such as truck transit, and sources of noise that are short duration, such as a truck start or an air brake. And so I can continue to talk a little bit about the differences there. So we looked at each of these sources in our assessment, and based on what was provided in the SSA study, because again, we were not looking to negate the SSA study, we were looking to expand upon it and provide a more robust analysis. So we were looking at the material that was provided. We considered each of these sources, truck transit, truck idling, truck starts, air brakes, things like that, and the duration of time we would anticipate each of those events to occur. And then we decided which of those sources we would need to include in our assessment and evaluate against the WAC limits. We determined that truck transit should be modeled, movement of trucks around the site, truck idling, and we would start with that and see how those lined up with the Washington Administrative Code limits. So the sound sources that were provided by SSA in Table 8 of their report, and I don't recall the exhibit number of the SSA report, but Table 8 of the SSA study identifies sound levels and their reference sound levels. So meaning that a sound level reference to 25 feet. And then you would use that, and you can use that reference level and the calculations that SSA did and Dr. D'Souza did to compute what the propagation would be at a further distance away. And so if you look at that table, you'll note that truck transit noise is identified it's equal to or higher than each of the other sound sources that are listed in that table. For our model for truck transit, I indicated the other day that we use the CAD model and with a federal highway noise model in it that has slightly higher reference sound levels than those listed in the table. That's how we use our model to evaluate trucks. So we stuck with that. For truck idling, we kept the same reference level that was used by SSA. And then we modeled it in our we evaluated them in our model, and we looked at what the emissions would be offsite, and the assumption is that these trucks would travel around the site at the volumes that we have were provided by the transportation engineer over the course of an hour. And then we would evaluate those against the WAC's base limits. So those limits that are identified in the Washington Administrative Code table, that 60 during the day, 50 at night. And so we found that the noise emissions from truck transit and from truck idling would meet these daytime and nighttime limits. And so to back up for a second, you recall that I said that the sound level limits in the table are essentially an L25, a sound level that's exceeded by 15 minutes of an hour. And so these are for sounds that go for at least 15 minutes. And so we presumed that would be the case for the truck transit on the site. For shorter duration sounds like a truck brake or a truck engine start, those are very short durations in a matter of just a few seconds. And so the combined duration of time over the course of an hour for a series of truck starts and truck idling would be much less than 15 minutes. It would be maybe a minute, maybe 2 minutes combined, depending on the source that we're talking about. Because we have reference levels that are the same or lower than truck transit for truck idling and truck engine starts, it stands to reason that if we're meeting the limits with a source that's going to go for at least 15 minutes over the course of an hour, that a source that happens for a much shorter duration of time at lower sound level reference would also meet those base limits, and of course would also meet those shorter duration limits that allow for an even higher sound level. I'm not sure if that makes sense. It's a very confusing process to explain, so I hope that clarifies a little bit why or how we did that.
Thank you, Mr. Warner.
Okay.
I appreciate the detailed technical explanation. If I can boil it down just for maybe for a short layperson statement, would it be accurate to say that you did consider the short duration sounds?
Yeah, so we did, and I suppose a way to wrap or put a bow on that discussion is that we did consider them when we evaluated the longer duration sounds that were essentially louder than the short duration sounds. And we were meeting these lower limits. There was no need to evaluate the shorter durations. So we could evaluate them, throw in the model. The results would be emissions that are the same, but mostly slightly lower than what we're seeing already for truck transit, truck idling.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Did you hear Dr. D'Souza's testimony that she did not see how your study invalidates the prior SSA study?
I did.
And can you respond to that statement?
Yes. So again, the study that we did was not intended to invalidate the SSA study. Our study was intended to evaluate noise emissions from the site, essentially using a more robust methodology and expand upon the assessment, confirm the SSA conclusions that the project noise impacts would not be significant.
Thank you. And did you, I heard that you heard Dr. D'Souza's testimony. Did you also review her noise analysis, which were in exhibits A46 and A47?
Yes, I did.
Okay. I'd like to ask you a few questions about that analysis. So first, did you read her assumptions about the number of trucks that would be on site?
Yes, I did.
And can you respond?
Sure. So, so Dr. D'Souza computed sound exposure levels of various truck activities to calculate average sound levels for various time periods based on multiple events occurring at the same location over a given time period. And then compared these against the WAC day and nighttime limits. Her assessment generally agrees with the SSA study. Her calculations agree with the SSA study regarding compliance for all sources from the site, except for truck idling during nighttime hours. And for the assessment of truck idling, and as well as other sources, Dr. D'Souza included some overly conservative and I would say erroneous assumptions. One is that the assessment for the site, she evaluated for a site other than an industrial or a land use other than an industrial park, specifically the so-called the high Q uses that have more traffic than industrial parks. And we've heard from the traffic engineer that the project is not designed for uses other than those that were considered for industrial park. And so the truck, the 1,000 or trucks per 1,000 square feet for an industrial park volumes are the only ones that are appropriate for our analysis. And also, further to that, Dr. Souza also looked at the minimum and the maximum hourly truck trips per 1,000 square feet for each of those facility types, and concluded that there would be non-compliance based on that list of or those graphs that were presented at some point in earlier testimonies were. You see minimum max values. Using the maximum values, you have much higher truck volumes for some of these high cube industrial land use types, and impacts were projected. And of course, we learned that those, and in our assessment in discussions with transportation engineer, was that those are not how you do a transportation study. Use the average volumes. And again, for the industrial park, not for these other uses. And so that use of those maximum values of high cube and other types of uses greatly overstated the truck volumes on the site.
Thank you. And is it standard practice when you do a noise analysis that you're analyzing what is proposed as opposed to something that is not proposed?
Yes. It is. And further to that, for questions about traffic, we will coordinate and consult with the traffic engineer to ensure that we're using traffic data that is an accurate representation of their assessment.
Thank you. And did you hear and review Dr. D'Souza's assumptions about the location of trucks on site?
Yes, I did.
Can you respond?
Sure. So essentially, Dr. D'Souza's assessment does not account for the distribution of truck sources around the site, around the proposed warehouses, proposed buildings. And that would be along either side of the building or throughout the site itself. This is the same approach that was applied to SSA by SSA. However, it's an overly conservative approach because it essentially assumes that all of the noise from truck transit, the truck movement would occur at a single point. So although it's a truck movement sound, it doesn't move. It's a stationary point, and then all of the trucks from the various buildings would occur at that same point at a specific distance away. So it's a highly over conservative and not realistic way to do it. That's why we applied our modeling, which looks at the trucks moving through the site, more accurate representation.
Thank you.
And I'll just say too, that was the same assessment that was applied for, or the same approach was applied for truck idling, truck starts, things like that, all from the same point.
All right. And so are there any other factors that would affect sound levels that Dr. D'Souza did not take into account?
Yes.
Tell me what those would be.
Sure, excuse me. Right, so as I indicated, we used a computer noise model to evaluate noise emissions from the site. What that does is allows us to consider some of these factors, other factors that affect noise propagation, such as variations in topography, ground absorption, meteorological conditions, buildings, things like that might obstruct noise propagation. And ground absorption may also enhance noise propagation. So all these factors, like paved sites. So we included pavement as a ground source, which has a certain acoustic reflection to it. But we also looked at ground absorption where it was appropriate to do so. And so all these factors built into a model and accurately built into a model will provide for a much more meaningful result.
Thank you. And so finally, do you agree with Dr. D'Souza's conclusions?
No, I do not.
And are there particular, and can you elaborate on why not?
Sure. So essentially, I do not agree. I agree with her approach of using these calculations to verify SSA. That's the same process. However, as I stated, there were a lot of assumptions and things that took it a lot farther. For example, using like I indicated, the maximum truck volumes from sources other than industrial park land uses. It doesn't accurately reflect the sound levels. The other thing that she did in her study was look at or make an assumption about a 15-minute truck idling time. We've heard in earlier testimony that that's unlikely, and our assessment looked at a 5-minute idling time, which is more realistic. And based on experience of seeing trucks in other warehouses, other locations, I don't often see a truck sitting there idling for 15 minutes at a site. But the main thing is the idea that it includes all of these sources, truck idling, truck transit, whatever, occurring at the same location on the site. And so these create a very, very conservative assessment of your quote unquote worst case receptor location. And it wouldn't occur in reality. And so her assessment was done for building A. It was also done for building B. The same conservative assumptions. So overall, there was predictions of impacts that would really not occur for these selected activities at the site. We've demonstrated with our assessment that these conclusions are incorrect. And there's really there's nothing in her analysis that responds to the modeling that we conducted.
And finally, is there anything in Dr. D'Souza's analysis that changes your opinion that the project will not result in significant adverse noise impacts?
No, there isn't.
Thank you, Mr. Warner. Those are all the questions that I have for you.
Okay. Are there questions for this witness from the city so that we can get the full respondent scope before the appellants cross?
No questions from the city. Thank you.
All right. So Ms. Tack Hooper, then it's to you for cross-examination.
Sounds good. Hi, Mr. Warner.
Hi
I just want to clarify, all your calculations assumed that the noise barrier described in SSA acoustics report was in place, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And I want to ask you a few questions about the assumptions you applied when you were measuring, or rather modeling the noise impacts from deep dynamic compaction. So if I understand what you did, you modeled it at new receptors that were further from the project than the ones that SSA acoustics used. Is that accurate?
Well, to clarify, SSA acoustics did not use receptors. They use distances. And you're right. We looked at receptors that were closer to where people would be hanging out and residing. So where the impacts or the sound levels from construction would be more meaningful.
Okay. And to get that modeling of the in-home impacts, did you also take into account some kind of barrier attenuation from the actual home or not?
You mean from the building envelope itself?
Yes.
No, we were looking at outdoor sound levels.
Okay. And you did not calculate noise levels from trucks traveling to and from the facility. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay. And with respect to your assumptions about idling, do I understand that you assumed that 15% of the trucks traveling to each building would idle for 5 minutes each?
I don't recall the percentage, but we had the number of trucks that would go to the site. I'd have to check my report to the percentages, but yeah, a number of them would certainly be distributed around the site idling, and we included that in our model.
So I can pull up, let's see, it's exhibit B18 at PDF page 13 if you want to look at the report. Let's see. I believe it's the first bullet after table 4. Can you just help me understand?
Sure.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, yep. So 15% is correct.
Okay, and so what was your assumption with respect to the other 85% of the trucks? Did you assume that they would not idle at all?
We didn't include them in the assessment of truck idling. Or as idling sources.
Is that different from assuming that they would not idle?
Well, no, I mean, they might idle during a different hour than we assumed, but we looked for the hour. So the modeling is done to represent an hour. And then we compare that hour against day or night, assuming that this is an hour that's representative of any hour that could happen during the day. And so in that, we looked at 15% idling for 5 minutes per hour.
Okay. And you noted that SSA acoustic study had assumed that the truck traffic during peak hours would be evenly divided across the project's 4 buildings, correct?
Correct.
Would you agree that's not a reasonable assumption in light of the different physical properties of those buildings?
Well, when we did our study, we decided to take a different approach, the same approach that Dr. D'Souza took, and look at a more evenly or proportionally distributed traffic throughout the various buildings. So, the reason for that was for buildings that were, say, smaller than 25% or had less than 25% of the number of loading docks, it would be a more accurate representation of those. And for trucks that had more than 25% of the overall loading docks, it would be a more accurate representation of those. So more trucks for those buildings and fewer trucks for the smaller buildings.
Okay. And your study states that you assume trucks would be distributed among the 4 buildings in a manner proportional to the number of loading docks. But
That's
I didn't.
right.
Okay, but I didn't see anything in the report that stated what number of loading docks you believed were on each side of buildings A and B, or what data source you were
Okay.
relying on for those numbers. Is that in there somewhere?
Yeah, it might not have been in there, but essentially it can be easily replicated if you look at the applicant's plans, site building plans that show the loading docks, and you just count them up, and you can kind of come up with a total number on either side of each building and total for each building, and we based it on that.
Okay, I noted that SSA acoustics numbers didn't come out to the same percentages of yours. But you were not using the numbers in the SSA acoustics report. You were looking at, okay.
Yeah, that's right. Because again, they did not use a proportional distribution. They used a 25% split among the buildings.
Oh, I was asking about your loading docks numbers.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah.
Okay. I want to ask you about the Federal Transit Administration's Transit Noise and Vibration Impact Assessment Manual.
Okay.
Has Washington adopted that manual for the purpose of analyzing noise from warehouse or industrial park projects under SEPA?
No, they have not.
Okay. Based on your calculations, actually, let me back up. I want to ask you about your assumptions of the ambient noise levels. Those were based on the measurements taken at the site by SSA Acoustics. Is that correct?
Well, they weren't taken at the site. They were taken adjacent to the site, I believe. Or
Sure.
as representative of those nearby homes as they were able to obtain.
Okay. And specifically just one of the 2 places where SSA Acoustics took ambient noise levels. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
All right, I think I'm almost done here. You testified that Dr. D'Souza's assumptions regarding traffic levels were erroneous. The applicant identified you as a noise expert. I just want to make sure you're not holding yourself out as an expert in trip generation analysis, are you?
No, I'm basing that on the testimony that's already been given in this hearing.
Okay, and you're not suggesting that you're qualified to resolve the disputes in the case over the appropriate ITE land use category to apply to the proposed project?
No, I'm certainly not.
Okay, that's all I have.
Is the redirect based on the cross?
I think I have just two quick questions for you, Mr. Warner. First, you were asked about the noise barrier and whether your model assumed the noise barrier. In your opinion, would your, even absent the noise barrier, would there be a significant adverse noise impact?
No, there would not.
Okay. And then I'd like to follow up on the question you were asked about the assumption about 15% of the trucks idling in any given hour. Do you believe that this assumption was appropriate?
Yes, I do.
And just, can you explain to us why that is the case?
Because we would have trucks that would be coming in and connecting to a loading dock, and at 15% volume seemed like a reasonable volume to be loading and unloading, or getting ready to fire up and take off again, or backing up and idling for a minute and shutting down. It was an estimate, but it seemed like a reasonable estimate based on other studies that we've done and observations we've made at facilities, similar types of facilities in the past.
And so if I'm understanding you correctly, this is an estimate of how many of the trucks would get to a loading dock and load and unload within 1 hour span.
Within 1 hour span, correct. And if we had assumed a higher percentage, it wouldn't have changed the results much at all, because if we're talking about a 5-minute duration, and 15% of the trucks at 5 minutes, even if you doubled that and said 30% of the trucks or 45% of the trucks, the overall sound levels would only increase by a small amount relative to the overall levels that we're estimating off site.
Thank you. And just to make things extra clear, this doesn't mean that you completely ignored the other 85% of the trucks, right?
No, they're still operating on the site and driving around and moving and part of the activity at the site.
Thank you. I have no further questions for Mr. Warner.
All right, so I think that takes us to the applicant's last witness, if I'm looking at the list correct at this point.
That is correct.
We have Lisa Corey, and she's on the ball right there on the screen. So just so everyone knows, scheduling wise, we're at 9:33 here. We'll start the examination of her. We will take probably at least a 5-minute break quickly around 10:30-ish. So with that said, let's go ahead and get you sworn in. If you raise your right hand on the screen, please. You swear and affirm that the testimony you're about to give as part of this proceeding today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth under penalty of perjury.
I do.
Go ahead.
Good morning, Dr. Corey.
Good morning.
Can you please briefly summarize your qualifications?
Sure. So I have a bachelor's degree in biology and a master's degree in environmental toxicology. I also have a PhD in environmental toxicology with risk emphasis. All of those are from University of Washington. I'm also a diplomate of the American Board of Toxicology, which is the board certifying group for my profession. And let's see, I work with Intertox. I'm currently both senior toxicologist and the director of operations. I have been here for almost 19 years practicing. During that time, I have done risk assessments and chemical assessments on hundreds of different chemicals, but also biological agents, noise, and odor. And that's all a standard part of my practice.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Mr. Karpman if you could please share Exhibit B8, which is stipulated. And Dr. Corey, can you tell us what this is?
This is my current CV.
Thank you. And you can stop sharing now. Thank you. Can you please tell us what your role has been with regard to this project?
Sure. So I was not involved in the permitting process. I was brought in more recently to provide an independent review of the materials, particularly in related to any type of health claims. So my focus in this was really on the air and the noise reports.
Thank you. And what did you do to prepare for your testimony today?
I reviewed the materials that were submitted to the city. Again, I was really focusing on the reports that had to do with health. So the air report, including the construction addendum, the noise report. I looked at the MDNS. I also had the opportunity to speak ahead of time to the experts who prepared the reports for noise and air, who we've heard from as part of this hearing. And I also looked at the appellant's materials that had to do with any type of health effect.
So what process would you typically use to evaluate the health impacts of a project?
Sure. So what I'm going to be describing here is really just the risk assessment process, which is a standard and well-accepted approach in my field. So it's a 4-step process. And the first is really to determine what the agents of concern are. Often for me, also as a toxicologist, those are going to be chemicals. But as I mentioned, they can also be physical, such as noise, but can be radiological or biological. And all of these will follow basically the same framework process for risk assessment. So that's step 1. Step 2 is to evaluate what those exposures are. The exposures can be actual measurements if that's available, but more often we see the results of modeling to provide estimates, but sometimes it can be other methods to provide estimates, such as looking at the literature. But modeling is really the standard approach, which is what we're seeing here. Third is to look at the dose response relationship. So really, what are the effects that we know occur with different levels of exposure? And what we're focusing on there is really, what is the critical effect? What's the effect that's going to occur at the lowest level? Because we know that we can be, if we are protective of that lowest effect, anything up beyond that is also going to be protected against. So we're really looking for that critical effect. If possible here, we look to regulatory thresholds because those are going to be based on that critical effect. And then finally, the 4th step is to bring that all together. How do the levels of exposure compare to what we know about that critical effect dose? And then if we do end up with the exposure estimates lower than where we know that critical effect is, we can be reasonably assured that no adverse health effects are likely to occur from that exposure.
All right. So reviewing these steps as applied to this project, first, were all chemicals or other exposures of interest evaluated?
Yes. Looking at both the air and the noise report, the air report, we had the toxic air pollutants. I'll try to go back and make sure I'm defining my acronyms as well. Those are the TAPs. And then also the criteria air pollutants from the National Ambient Air Quality so standards, that's the NAAQS. And then going on to noise, as Mr. Warner just testified, the residential exposures were all modeled. So those were all an appropriate group of chemicals and noise receptors to evaluate.
So then second, with regard to this project, were the exposures appropriately calculated or modeled?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I was looking at and relying on both the air and the noise reports. Again, the reports are really the scope, kind of the full scope that I would expect, and the quality that I would expect to see in any assessment like this. So in going through those, the methods were and the modeling were appropriate and really reliable for this type of assessment.
So third, are there standards that you can use here to evaluate health impacts? And I'll just kind of go through the various potential sources here. So starting with discussing health impacts that may be associated with air quality emissions from on-site operations, were there standards that were appropriate to use there?
Yeah, absolutely. So that is, if we can remember back to Ms. Goff's testimony, what they looked at were the TAPs, the toxic air pollutants, and those were compared to the de minimis standard, the small quantity emission rate, the SCOR, and then for any chemicals that exceeded the SCOR, they looked at the ASOL, the acceptable source impact level. All of these are the appropriate standards to look at. They are all conservative and health protective, and they already include kind of a baked in accounting for sensitive populations in the derivation of those values.
So then turning to health impacts associated with cars and trucks traveling to and from the site, are there standards that are appropriate to use in evaluating health impacts from those sources?
Yeah, there are. I guess I also did want to kind of reiterate there. We heard in Ms. Goff's testimony that there is the comparison kind of to those same TAP levels to the off-site and on-site total sources. And she had described that as there to be informational, but they really weren't the appropriate standards for that. And I would agree with that conclusion and that assessment of that. She further testified the more appropriate ones to look at in this case really were that prevention of significant decline, the PSD for the NACs. And again, any of the estimated exposures were below the level for that. And then she had also looked at the National Highway Administration levels, which are also the same as what OSHDOT has adopted, and it was below any threshold for that as well.
And then are there standards that can be used to evaluate health impacts of noise?
Yes, again, as we just heard Mr. Warner testify to, there are standards that are both set by the city and by ecology. The ecology ones in particular are health-based and intended to prevent any impact to public health. And again, it was below the levels for those as well.
Okay, so based on all of the information that you have reviewed and the testimony that you have heard, what are your conclusions with regard to potential health impacts from this project?
Sure. So in the reports, again, the conclusions were really that the estimated exposures are going to be below any of these thresholds. Again, those conclusions are supported by the results of the studies of the reports. And again, they're based on appropriate and reliable modeling and thresholds for comparison. So based on that, I would agree with the conclusions of both of those reports that no adverse health effects would be expected. And that would be my opinion in this as well, that based on the materials that are available, no adverse health impacts are expected.
Were you here for the testimony of Dr. Fanning?
I was.
And I'd like to ask you a couple of questions regarding her testimony. So first, did you hear her testimony regarding the health risks that are associated with the various different air pollutants that she discussed?
I did.
And can you respond to that testimony?
Sure. What Dr. Fanning presented was kind of what we would call the hazard assessment, the hazard identification. It looks at the different health effects of chemicals that are possible given all potential exposures. But one of the fundamental tenets of toxicology is the dose makes the poison. That's something probably some of you have heard before. And that's a really critical aspect of this. I wouldn't be in disagreement with her that at some level, those health effects can all occur. And that's, again, why we have these regulatory thresholds is because we know that. But in this case, there needs to be that additional comparison to what the exposure is. And again, in this case, the exposures are well below the levels that are going to cause any potential health impact.
Thank you. Did you hear her testimony that health impacts will occur based on the total emissions by both on-site air sources and off-site mobile sources?
Yeah, again, with that, I think that was looking at in the TRC report where there's a total of the on-site and off-site as compared to the TAPS levels. And as
I'll just break up my question. I want to be sure we talk about each one. So first, just can you respond to that testimony with regard to the on-site sources?
Yeah. So for the chemicals that were evaluated, which were, the TAPS list, the levels were below the scores for all but two. That was the diesel particulate matter and the NOx. Those were, because they didn't pass that screening level, they went to the next level of evaluation. Again, that's really a common thing in risk assessment. You go through these screening levels, and if it's below that level, you know there's not going to be any concern and you don't have to move that forward. This is an additional level of screening because it wasn't above that level where it was completely sure. There's the next level of screening, which is to do exposure modeling and then compare that to the ASOL, as I mentioned. And recalling back to Ms. Goff's testimony, it's the modeled levels are well below the ASOLs for both diesel particulate matter and NOx.
All right. And so now the question that I think I had started out with, can you respond to her testimony regarding potential health impacts of the combination of both on-site and then those off-site mobile sources?
Sure. Sorry to jump ahead on you. Where I was going with that one is the total was compared to, again, the TAPS levels. Those are intended for stationary sources. And so really applying that to the mobile sources, the offsite sources, in addition to the on-site sources, it's not an appropriate comparison. It's really, an apples to oranges comparison. So again, it's there informationally, but that wasn't the appropriate comparative.
And were the standards that you previously testified about today, are those, in your opinion, more appropriate to use to evaluate health impacts?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the PSD and the National Highway Administration levels.
Thank you. Did you hear her testimony, Dr. Fanning's testimony, that the analysis failed to take into account potential sensitive receptors? I believe she mentioned daycares, schools, and parks, and a few other potentially sensitive receptors.
Yeah, and one of the things to understand is just in how these regulatory thresholds are derived. They are based on a scientific study that could be in humans, it could be in animals, it could be in an entire population. But they're really they're starting out with a level that didn't cause any effect in that population. And then from that, they're applying safety factors to drop it down lower and lower. And one of those safety factors is really to adjust that dose to account for sensitive populations. So I said that kind of earlier, a little offhand, that it's the protection of sensitive populations is baked into that number. And that's what I mean, that when we're looking at those regulatory thresholds, they're already accounting for sensitive populations in that value.
Okay. And so then turning to noise, did you hear her testimony that noise impacts would have health consequences?
Yeah, and again here, I mean, I think we have heard Mr. Warner's testimony very, very recently that was a really conservative approach to be able to use. He's modeling residential receptors. It's a very sophisticated and robust analysis, and it was still below any level of concern.
And finally, did you hear Dr. Fanning's testimony that the air quality study did not analyze cumulative impacts of the air emissions and other environmental concerns affecting South Tacoma?
It did. And so when we look at cumulative impacts, there isn't a prescribed way to do that, especially when we're looking at different potential stressors from the environment, whether it's a physical effect like noise and or a chemical effect like air pollution. But there are some qualitative ways that we can look at it to make an assessment on that overall. One is really to look at the conservative measures that were taken in the exposure estimates. That's true for both the air and the noise reports. And I think we've heard that a lot during this hearing. The second, though, is to look at the health protectiveness, again, of those regulatory thresholds that we're comparing it to. Like I just mentioned, those are already accounting for sensitive populations. They're accounting for various durations of exposure. So we're already comparing an overestimate of the likely exposure to a level that's very health protective and matching those up. Since the levels for the air pollutants are really, I mean, we're looking at a level below or a level that's not going to cause any type of health effect. We're really looking at like a zero health effect, and we're comparing that to noise, which is also below, which is basically a no effect. So, I mean, I'm using numbers, but I really mean this more in a qualitative way. We're looking at no effect plus no effect, and so the expectation is that there's no effect total as well.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Does the city have questions for this witness?
The city has no questions. Thank you.
All right, so cross-examination then.
Okay, hi, Dr. Corey. I want to make sure I understand your testimony about, I believe you said it was step 2 of the risk assessment process involves evaluating exposures. Does exposures refer to the concentrations of pollutants that the people will actually be exposed to?
It can. There's different ways of doing it. And so when you say concentration, I generally think of concentration as an amount per a volume of air, which would be one way of doing it. And that's actually how the ASIL is compared. What we're talking about earlier on in the screening part is we're looking at a rate, a mass per unit of time. So say pounds per year. And so that is also a way of doing it. The important part of that is that the regulatory level or any other type of dose threshold that you're looking at later is the same.
Okay. You testified that modeling concentrations of pollutants from off-site vehicles traveling to and from the facility and comparing those concentrations to the ASILs wouldn't be appropriate because the ASILs are part of a regulatory framework that applies to stationary sources. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes, so that comparison to any of those measures that I mentioned, right? The de minimis, the score that applies to the tax.
Okay. PSD increments are also part of a regulatory framework that applies to stationary sources, correct?
It can be.
Is it part of some regulatory framework that applies to mobile sources?
Yeah, so in this case, the reason why it was a more appropriate measure was because it's really looking at a large, broader area, the countywide, and that was how the offsite sources were also estimated.
So you're not testifying that PSD increments are part of some regulatory framework that applies to mobile sources, correct?
Correct.
Okay, just stationary sources.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
Okay, and in fact, they apply to major stationary sources undergoing new source review, correct?
Correct.
Okay. That is all I have.
Thank you.
All right, give me just a moment here. Catch up on my final note taking there.
I have no further questions for Dr. Corey.
Okay, so no redirect. And I think that concludes the applicant's witnesses then. So does the applicant rest in its presentation for this hearing?
The applicant does rest, however, there's one matter that we did want to address before we conclude here. I understand that appellants may have a procedural matter to raise, and if they do, I think this would be the appropriate time.
Yes.
Okay, well, we are.
Oh, go
one
ahead.
second.
Of course.
We are at a transition point then, so that may be appropriate to raise that at this point. From my perspective, then I guess, and just making sure again, the city's already put on all of its witnesses, correct?
The city has put on all its witnesses and yes, absolutely, I'm rested.
So when I say we're at a transition point, then we're done. Everybody has presented their case in chief at this point. What we have left to deal with then is rebuttal, unless this procedural matter that the appellants have is going to throw a wrench into that. So I guess, my anticipation was that we were moving towards rebuttal at this point. But procedural matter then, appellants, Ms. Tack Cooper, what do you have for me?
Sure, it has to do with Mr. Gladney's declaration. We've had a chance to review it. We would like to cross-examine him. We think it's important to understand what he was characterizing as a fulfillment center or parcel hub in his declaration. The declaration just has a lot of qualifiers and subjective language. And so we let the applicant know that we would like to cross-examine him about his declaration.
Ms. Kaler?
So the applicant would not object to that with a few caveats. First, Mr. Examiner, as you know, Mr. Gladney was not on our witness list, nor the witness list of any other party. And his declaration was provided solely to respond to a question that the examiner had. And so for that reason, if he is subject to cross-examination, we believe that that cross-examination should be very strictly limited to the specific statements made in his declaration. Would not be an opportunity to range into subjects beyond those specifically discussed in his declaration. Would not be not a deposition opportunity here. So with that limitation first, and then secondly, I would just note for the record that there was a reason why we did not put Mr. Gladney or any other person to testify to similar subject matter on our witness list. And that's because while we're happy to respond to the examiner's question, we do not believe that the use of any other bridge property or facility is technically relevant to the subject matter of this hearing. Of course, we are here to talk about this project and its use. So I wanted to just put that on the record. And then finally, Mr. Gladney is here. He is available right now for cross-examination. And I would suggest that if he is to be cross-examined, we go ahead and do that now at the conclusion of our case, because technically he was, he wasn't our witness, but he was our declarant. So I think this would be an appropriate time if the examiner is going to allow it.
I do think it would be an appropriate time. I will state my agreement with the only reason we've gone down this path is because I had questions and I asked them. And so from a relevant standpoint, I thought it was relevant, the questions I asked. And so that's why I asked them. And I appreciate the declaration being presented as quickly as it was. I understand the quick time turnaround was probably the reason for a lot of the qualifying language that's been referred to by Ms. Tack Cooper already. And I understood that when I read the declaration. And so I do agree. I think that cross-examination of this witness, I think, should be limited to essentially the scope of the questions that I asked. And as best I can recall at this point, without having the transcript here to refer back to or to go back to the video or whatever, my questions to which the declaration was submitted as a response were, how many Bridgepoint facilities exist at this point that are operating as the high cube? And I guess I'll qualify that by I think the highest traffic generating IT land use was transsort or transload. If those are different, it should be. Go ahead and correct me on that without looking back at my notes.
And Mr. Examiner,
For certain.
Mr. Examiner, the high cube fulfillment center sort. There's a sort and a non-sort. The high cube fulfillment center sort was the highest trip generator. The transload, the high cube transload, is actually a lower trip generator.
Right. Yeah. And so Ms. Tack Cooper, your experts used which land use designation?
My experts looked at all of the high cube warehouse categories.
I know they did, but they settled on one in particular, I think, in stating that the applicant and the city should have done something more. Isn't that correct?
No, that's not. They said that it was suitable for all of the high cube uses and they should have looked at all of them.
All right. You're making this difficult. So I'm going to take that one then, the one that's the higher one, the highest one, and that's the question. And I think that's what I was really looking at in my questioning and asking for some additional information. So it's the high cube.
So there are two. There's
hold on. Let me finish. I know I'm a slow talker. People always want to jump into those gaps. It's the same when I'm driving. I try to leave a safe following distance. Everybody jumps into the gaps. But that's just, it's the way I am. So for purposes of the question then, my question, what I wanted to determine was how many Bridgepoint facilities are out there, more specifically in Washington, but across the country generally, that are operating as high cube fulfillment sort. And that's really what the question was. And if it wasn't articulated well enough when the response came in, that's what the question really was, that highest generating use. And the follow-on question to that was, if Bridgepoint has those facilities that operate as a high cube fulfillment sort, whether any of those started out through the entitlements regulatory review process as being designated as an industrial park and then changed. That was really the scope of my questions, twofold. And that's what the cross-examination, I think, should be limited to.
Can I just note that there were two high cube uses that generate higher traffic levels? It's fulfillment center sort and parcel hub, and those are what Mr. Gladney focused on.
Okay, so either one of those then.
Okay.
We can inquire on beyond what was, I mean, not beyond, but within the scope of what was provided in the declaration. If there are follow-up and clarification questions to that, those can be asked now. And with that said, we need to swear in Mr. Gladney, and then Ms. Cooper, you can ask some clarifying questions within the scope that we've outlined here. So the scope of what was responded to in the declaration, and really the scope of my questions, which precipitated that to begin with. So Mr. Gladney, if you'd raise your right hand, please. You swear and affirm that the testimony you're about to give as part of this proceeding today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth under penalty of perjury.
I do.
And before Ms. Cooper, before we inquire, I think there was a little bit of background provided in the declaration, but Mr. Gladney, can you tell us a little bit about why you were the one who responded to the questions that I raised back, I don't know, on day 1 or day 2?
Yeah.
What
So,
your background is that qualifies you to answer those questions, please?
No, I am the Senior Vice President of Development for Bridge Industrial's Pacific Northwest office. I have intimate knowledge of the projects within the state of Washington. At the time the question came out, I am the project lead for this particular project. And I reached out to associates within the company to try and determine as quickly as I could, as late as I could in the afternoon, the answers to the questions you raised.
Ms. Cooper, all yours.
Thank you. Mr. Gladney, your declaration says that you focused on high cube fulfillment center sort among a couple other categories. Can you explain what you were counting as a fulfillment center sort?
Yeah, absolutely. We were counting a traditional sort facility that is mezzanine structured, that has highly mechanized, basically, I would try not to use the word Amazon, but an Amazon fulfillment center.
Okay. And you also focused on parcel hubs. Can you explain what you were counting as a parcel hub?
A similar facility, highly mechanized, that has a large inbound and outbound component to it.
And your declaration said that less than 5% of Bridge Industrial's approximately 140 projects are currently used for either high cube fulfillment center or high cube parcel hub. According to my math, 5% of 140 is 7. Are you saying how many projects are you saying that fall into those categories?
My less than 5% is a conservative guess because of the time and nature to respond. In the conversations I had, frankly, I did not find a single fulfillment center or parcel hub, but felt prudent to at least allow 5%.
Okay. So I want to ask you about some particular facilities then that Bridge Industrial's website describes as places where Amazon has leased warehouse space greater than 200,000 square feet. So
I'm going to object to this line of questioning as beyond the scope of Mr. Gladney's declaration. I believe Mr. Gladney's declaration does not refer to any specific properties except for one in the state of Washington that I believe he stated was originally permitted in the 70s, so he didn't have any information on its original permitting. Other than that, I believe his declaration specifically states that because of the time constraints and other reasons, he was unable to look at specific individual facilities, and his declaration does not contain any statements about specific individual facilities.
That's fair. If I may suggest an alternative, we PDF'd, I think, 11 pages from the Bridge Industrial website. We'd be happy to put in a declaration. We think that these are evidence that Bridge is using its industrial park spaces for high cube warehouses to a greater extent than is reflected in Mr. Gladney's declaration or testimony. It's just Bridge Industrial's website. This is not hearsay, it's a party admission. We'd be happy to move that in with a declaration explaining what we think is the significance of each one.
And I would object to that declaration. The appellants have not put on the rebuttal testimony. If they have rebuttal testimony, they can provide it. Having looked at Bridge's website myself, I do not believe that there is anything on that website that is probative of the use type of particular facilities.
Yeah, I mean, if all we're doing is looking up stuff on Bridge's website, I'm not sure that's the kind of thing, even if I let it in, I'm going to give a whole lot of weight to, unless there's something else to be done with it. And I think that's maybe what Ms. Kaler is referring to in rebuttal. So if there was something that the appellants had, testimony that would show familiarity with the stuff that's been pulled off the website, and be able to testify to that, somehow contradicting what Bridge has already put into play through the declaration, that would be different. But a declaration stating that, hey, we've pulled these things off of Bridge's website, and we think they're something different than an industrial park. I don't know how probative that is when it's just pulled off the website. If there was something more to be offered in rebuttal, I'm certainly open to leaving that open. But I do think it's going a little bit beyond the scope of what I asked.
And Mr. Examiner, specifically, we would object to the submission of a declaration without the opportunity to cross-examine the declarant.
Yeah, and if the declaration was just going to say, I'm Jane Doe and I went to Bridgepoint's website and I found these PDF pages. Again, it's kind of a whatever, unless there's somebody who has firsthand knowledge about what those sites are than just what's pulled off the website. So it seems like kind of a path with no foundation, wanting to be more than it actually is. If there is more than there actually is to be offered in rebuttal, let's do it that way, but I'm not sure it's appropriate here.
Well, then may I question Mr. Gladney about them? As he is. Go ahead.
You can ask. I mean, I think, again, I asked, and so if you're asking him about stuff that you found that maybe looks more like something that is not being admitted to this point, that's fine.
Sure. Mr. Gladney, are you familiar with Bridgepoint Lacey?
Yes, I am.
And I understand that currently serves Amazon. Amazon occupies 510,000 square feet of that facility. Is that correct?
Yes, they do.
And the facility supports customer fulfillment for Amazon. Is that correct?
I don't know enough about their program to answer that.
Okay. So you're aware of it, but you don't know whether it's a fulfillment center or not. Is that correct?
It's not there's not a mezzanine component in the building. So if the question is it a fulfillment center with a mezzanine high cube component, I could say definitively no.
Okay, but you're not sure whether it's a fulfillment center without a mezzanine?
I am sure it is not a fulfillment center without a mezzanine.
I'm sorry, so what type of facility do you think Amazon is operating out of Bridgepoint Lacey?
Transload facility.
And that is based on what?
The LUC use of the building at the time of permitting.
Was Amazon a known tenant at the time of permitting?
Amazon submitted the permits. So let me clarify. and then maybe you don't have this information, Ms. Tad Cooper. Bridge Industrial sold the facility in 2020 prior to Amazon leasing it.
Okay. Are you familiar with Bridgepoint North in Waukegan, Illinois?
No,
Okay. Are you familiar with Bridgepoint Grove Industrial in Downers Grove, Illinois?
no,
Are you familiar with Bridgepoint 290 in Cicero, Illinois?
no,
Are you familiar with Bridgepoint Silicon Valley in Milpitas, California?
no,
Are you familiar with Bridgepoint Long Beach in Long Beach, California?
no,
Okay, are you familiar with Bridgepoint Tacoma 210 and 125?
yes,
Okay, are there tenants for those facilities at this time?
no,
Okay, and do I understand that your declaration, you looked only at Bridgepoint properties that currently have tenants, is that correct?
no,
It's not correct?
no.
In what respect is that wrong?
I looked at Washington properties that have both tenants and not tenants to confirm. To Mr. Hearing Examiner's question, how many of them started their life as Industrial Park 130 and how many had changed?
Okay. Is it, you would agree that Bridge Industrial is in promotional materials has touted the benefits of the two Tacoma properties I just mentioned for e-commerce and third-party logistics users? Is that fair?
And I'm going to object to this line of questioning. Promotional materials are not relevant to a project that doesn't actually have tenants, and also not responsive to the examiner's question and the subject matter here. The question was whether their bridge has any fulfillment centers, essentially high cube fulfillment centers, or high cube parcel hub, and whether any bridge project has changed, was originally permitted under Land Use Code 130 Industrial Park and has subsequently changed to a different use, to one of those two uses. And promotional materials for a vacant building are not relevant to that subject.
It does seem beyond the scope of what I asked, and I'll just say I'm a whole lot more concerned about things that are actually being used a certain way after they're constructed, as opposed to a facility that currently doesn't have tenants in it still.
And we would submit that it's relevant that Bridge is actively seeking out e-commerce tenants and logistics tenants of a type that are associated with the high cube warehouse uses rather than generic industrial park tenants.
I'm going to sustain the objection still, though.
Okay. Mr. Gladney, are you familiar with Bridgepoint Doral in Miami, Florida?
No,
Are you familiar with the Bridgepoint Sunset Industrial Park in Brooklyn?
no,
Okay. No other questions.
So I'm going to give Ms. Kaler the opportunity for some follow-up here, since there wasn't some, direct testimony, I guess, other than what was submitted in response to my questions. But I think there ought to be the opportunity for some clarification based on the cross-examination that was allowed here after my questioning and the declaration submittal. Are there questions to clarify what was asked on the cross?
Mr. Examiner, I have just a couple follow-up questions for Mr. Gladney about the Lacey facility.
Well,
Mr.
hold on one second. Let me ask for clarification that I have for my own then on the Lacey facility. Mr. Gladney, are you saying that Bridgepoint doesn't own that facility anymore? I thought you said it's been sold.
correct. We sold it in April of 2020 to Morgan Stanley, and Morgan Stanley has recently sold it again as of a few months ago to Dermody.
Okay, so given that it's been sold for almost 3 years, if we're just counting calendar year designations, I'm not sure how much relevance that facility has to anything anymore at this point. But Ms. Kaler, if you can tie that in, I guess go ahead and we'll see.
Thank you, Mr. Examiner. Mr. Gladney, is it your understanding that the building that Ms. Tack Hooper asked you about that is occupied by Amazon, is it your understanding that was permitted as a transload facility?
Yes,
To the best of your knowledge, is it being used consistent with that designation?
yes, it is.
Was that building, to your knowledge, originally permitted as a land use code 130 industrial park?
No, it was not.
I have no further questions for Mr. Gladney.
All right, thank you for your testimony here today. So we are ready to move to rebuttal then. I'm at the end of another sheet of notes here. It is 10:20. It's not 10:30 yet, but it seems like to me that maybe it would be a good time to take our mid-morning break and then move into rebuttal. And just so we know where we're headed then. Ms. Tack Hooper, who do you have first for us on rebuttal?
Our rebuttal will be short. We have just one rebuttal witness. He is unfortunately not available until 1. We didn't anticipate the applicant would wrap up quite so rapidly, but it will be short. So perhaps we could take an exceptionally long morning break and just reconvene at 1.
All right, let's try to figure out where we're headed then. Let's do a little map posting, sign posting, whatever, and see what we've got still to accomplish today. So it sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong, I may have been a little bit distracted there because I was shuffling notes and getting a new page up and ready. Ms. Tack Cooper, you said that the applicants, or the appellants rather, only have one rebuttal witness. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And so, you know, call me a bit of a stickler for these things, and a stickler in a setting, you know, an administrative appeal hearing where we don't have to be quite as sticky. But it would seem to me that sur rebuttal, and we talked about this before, I was going to give the opportunity for sur rebuttal, and then, you know, final word going to the appellants again, because they have the burden of proof to carry. But it seems to me that the sur rebuttal should be limited to the scope of what the initial rebuttal was. Does anybody have huge heartburn with that being sort of the parameter? Okay, I saw Ms. Kaler sort of shaking her head there, so we'll note that for the separate audio record. You're
No
okay with
concern
that?
from the applicant.
Okay, so without having heard the rebuttal, I suppose it's a little bit difficult. But Ms. Kaler, for the applicant side, what were you anticipating in terms of sur rebuttal with number of witnesses and time needed?
So, Mr. Examiner, our understanding from prior communications with the appellant is that their one rebuttal witness is Dr. McCarthy, and that he may address traffic and air quality matters as he did in his initial testimony. Based on that, we would not anticipate the only sur rebuttal we might possibly anticipate would be from Mr. Schramm and from Ms. Goff. I will say I obviously, without hearing Dr. McCarthy's testimony, I don't know whether we will have any sur rebuttal at all. If we do, Mr. Schramm would be available later today to provide that with regard to traffic. As we discussed at our last session, Ms. Goff, she's currently out of the country and she would not be able to provide sur rebuttal until the 10th.
And I can tell you now, he will not be putting on air testimony, just traffic.
Okay, then I will say there is some possibility we would have sur rebuttal from Mr. Schramm, but again, without hearing the testimony, I cannot tell you whether we will feel the need to put anything on or not.
But in any event, it sounds like we're going to be able to finish up today. Is that right?
Yes.
Unless perhaps some air testimony comes in and it's just burning to be sur rebutted, and we have to figure out a way to get Ms. Goff in here. Is that
Mr.
fair?
Examiner, oh, apologies.
No, go ahead.
I guess I'm one of those people just jumping into that gap, or maybe there wasn't much of a gap. So I just also wanted to comment that.
It was your turn anyway, so I was ready for you.
Thank you. The parties have discussed closing statements. I believe we have agreed to waive verbal closings, and we will provide our closings in our closing briefs.
And with that as the general parameter, I want to address that at the very end a little bit. I do want to give the city an opportunity to jump in here. Is the city anticipating any sir rebuttal testimony?
The city does not anticipate sir rebuttal testimony.
Okay. So with that additional information available to me now at this point, and I want to tell the parties, I really appreciate that you've been talking offline to try to figure out where things are going. Things always work a little bit better when you do that, and I appreciate that, and thank you for that. So it sounds like you've already sort of mapped things out for today. I will put a message up in the chat for people who come wandering in between now and 1 p.m. that we are in break until then. It sounds like we'll be okay to break until then and just reconvene at 1 o'clock for some brief rebuttal and possible sir rebuttal that would be within the scope of that already brief rebuttal. Is that fair where we're at then? All right, so thank you for everything this morning. It is 10:26. We will be paused and off the record then until 1 o'clock. Please be back at 1 p.m. then. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The watch clock, I keep waiting for it to turn from 12:59 to 1. As long as I'm watching it, it doesn't happen. There we go. All right, so we are back. It is August 4th, 2023. Clock has just struck 1 p.m. That was when we agreed to be back to address some rebuttal testimony, starting first with the appellants and then possibly from the applicants. Are we ready to go with that?
We are. The appellants call Dr. McCarthy.
Okay, and as we did with another witness earlier this morning, since it had been a week and all of that, I could try to state that you're still under oath because it's still the same proceeding, but I'm going to go ahead and just swear you in again. So if you'd raise your right hand, please. You swear and affirm that the testimony you're about to give as part of this proceeding today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth under penalty of perjury.
I do.
The appellants may inquire then on rebuttal.
Okay, Dr. McCarthy, much of Mr. Schramm's testimony addressed his opinions regarding the characteristics of high cube warehouses beyond how the trip generation manual described those categories. Does the trip generation manual supply any resources for learning more about the characteristics of high cube warehouses?
Yes, it does.
And what resource or resources are those?
The most important resource is the high cube warehouse vehicle trip generation analysis prepared by ITE and South Coast Air Quality Management District in 2016.
Okay, I'd like to show you what's been marked as Exhibit A78. We'll go to PDF page 8. And I'd like you to tell us if this is the memo referenced in the ITE trip generation manual.
Yes.
Okay, and are you familiar with this study?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Schramm testified that one reason he did not believe the site would be used as a fulfillment center is that in his experience, fulfillment center ceilings are higher than 40 feet. And he cited an example of a fulfillment center he said he believed had 80-foot ceiling heights. Is his characterization of the ceiling heights associated with fulfillment centers supported by this ITE memo?
Not directly, no. I mean, I don't want to contradict his experience, but the ceiling heights are described in the first row, and it states specifically that they are often as high as 40 feet for fulfillment centers. That's not saying they can't be higher than that, but that's what that's what the memo says.
Okay. And can you just briefly take us through what it says about the ceiling height for each of the high cube warehouse categories?
Sure. So transload facility, it says, is typically lower than for other high cube warehouses. So and so it will all be in relation to those other ones.
Right.
Short-term storage is between 28 and 34 feet, although some are taller. Cold storage is the biggest, typically higher. That's 70 to 100 feet. Fulfillment center is often as high as 40 feet, and that's for 3 levels of mezzanines for the rack storage. And then parcel hubs are typically not as tall. 18 to 20 feet is common, but again, there's wiggle room in all of these.
Okay. Is Mr. Schramm's testimony that fulfillment centers are significantly taller than 40 feet consistent with your experience?
No.
What can you tell us about what your experience tells you about the height of fulfillment centers?
Many jurisdictions have building height standards that allow a maximum building height, and a fulfillment center will be built to the maximum height allowed in that jurisdiction, whether it be 50 feet or 60 feet or 40 feet, whatever it is, they will build to whatever the height standard that is allowed, unless they can get a variance or something like that. And that is true across many jurisdictions where I have looked at environmental impact reports and permitting documents for hundreds of warehouses.
Okay, and you just mentioned you've reviewed documents about hundreds of warehouses. Are those high cube warehouses?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Schramm also testified about his understanding of the relationship between cross-dock warehouse facilities and high cube transload warehouses. Are high cube transload facilities the type of high cube warehouse most likely to have cross-docks?
No, cross docks are common at many of the high cube warehouse categories, and I believe there is another page of this table that will describe that specifically.
Sure, let's look at PDF 7 of A78.
Yes, you had it.
Oh,
go back. There we go. So as it states in the 4th filled in row, loading dock location, transload facilities can be 2 sides or 4 sides. Short-term storage is on either 1 or 2 sides, and then in parcel hub, it can be 2 sides and up to 4 sides. And I have seen both 1, 2, 3, and 4 dock door orientation. So there are orientations that work with whatever the specific building site location characteristics are, but many of these warehouses have cross docks or multiple dock locations.
okay, and going back to transload, I see that it says minimum of 2 sides adjacent or opposite. Does that mean that a transload facility is not necessarily cross dock at all?
It is not necessary. I mean, none of them are guaranteed to be cross-dock. That is just characteristic of many of them, but it is not always that way.
Okay, and can you remind us what the difference is between these categories of high cube warehouses? And if
Sure.
if there's a page in here you want us to turn to, we can do that.
Yes, I believe if we go to. Let me go to the specific page that I would like you to go. So on page 3 of the PDF, well, 5 of the PDF, 3 of the document, sorry. Right there. So this describes the 5 different classification schemes. So I can read that to you directly, or you can read it to yourselves, but
why don't you read it for us, please?
I'll read it directly. Transload is usually pallet loads or larger handling products of manufacturers, wholesalers, distributors, or retailers with little or no storage durations. Short-term storage is products held on site for a short time. And when they say short, a standard warehousing category is months long. So that is the typical duration of the old-fashioned 150 ITE land use category warehousing. So short-term storage is significantly shorter than that. Less than a month is a short storage time. Cold storage is high cube warehouse with permanent cold storage for, again, like food or perishables. Fulfillment center is storage and direct distribution of e-commerce products to end users. So your standard Amazon or some of the large box retailers that directly deliver to your door. And then parcel hubs are transload function for a parcel delivery company like UPS, FedEx, USPS. Those are next day delivery sort of services.
Okay. So I'm glad you mentioned general warehousing. I want to drill down a little bit on the distinction between general warehousing reflected in ITE land use category 150 and high cube warehousing. What does this ITE memo tell us about the types of businesses that use high cube warehouses as distinct from general warehousing?
Well, it says many things about them, but well, let's go down to who uses the different. Do you want specific? Well, can you rephrase that question to exactly which high cube warehouse category you want to talk about?
Certainly. Let's see. Let's look at. Well, so actually, I'm sorry, Ms. Brechtel, can you put that back up? Thank you. Okay, so that first paragraph on this page, towards the bottom of the first paragraph, this says a typical high cube warehouse has a high level of on-site automation and logistics management. Can you explain what that means and why a tenant would want on-site automation and logistics management?
Yes, they tend to be dealing with high throughput and high amounts of goods coming in and trying to move it out and redistribute it as quickly as possible. Or in the case of e-commerce or parcel hubs, they have deadlines where they need to deliver things as soon as possible. And then in terms of third-party logistics, which are the types of redistribution logistics centers where a third-party operator will ship something from a trans-Pacific trade, for example, for a small business and then ship it out to the local retailer or the local business in order to have those goods. So they typically, a smaller business that can't, have a whole cube to themselves might do a third-party logistics retailer in order to have those sorts of services. So having all of those things in inventory requires a lot of automation and sorting in order to have it be efficient.
Okay, let's look at PDF page 3. The findings section, the first sentence of findings says, the high cube warehouse market continues to evolve as individual tenants / owners implement different e-commerce business plans. What is e-commerce and how does it relate to high cube warehouse categories?
Well, e-commerce is, I mean, the easiest way to describe it is sort of the Amazon model of business, where you have goods that are purchased online and then they're delivered either directly to your house or for pickup at a specific location or retailer. So any online shopping, I think, would be considered e-commerce.
Okay. And in the purpose paragraph on this page at the top of the page, I see that last line refers to facilities that are commonly called high cube warehouse distribution centers. Is distribution center associated with all of the high cube warehouse categories or a particular one? Can you explain that term to us?
Well, there are different types of distribution centers, but I generally lump them into the national distribution centers where there's say an original equipment manufacturer or a parts manufacturer like Hyundai or Toyota who will ship their parts overseas and then they will redistribute it to all their local dealerships through their national distribution center or through their regional distribution center, because there's lots of different individual dealers and auto body shops that might want those parts, for example. So that is a distribution center purpose. National distribution centers might do that for the whole country. Regional distribution centers would be for a smaller region of the country, for example.
Okay. And the second paragraph on this page, definition of high cube warehouse, in the middle, it again says a typical high cube warehouse has a high level of on-site automation and logistics management. The automation and logistics enable highly efficient processing of goods. Can you explain what highly efficient means in this context?
Highly efficient means both fast, and it means with as little manual labor as possible. And it also means that the modern goal is to automate as many of the processes as possible. So you need fewer and fewer workers to do the same amount of work. So the efficiencies are in both labor and in time.
And so how does automation affect the required levels of employee parking for a high cube warehouse?
As a warehouse becomes more automated, you will need less parking.
Okay. I'd like to look at Exhibit B23 at PDF 2. These are the land use descriptions from the trip generation manual. And my question for you, Dr. McCarthy, is the industrial park land use category related to high cube warehousing categories?
Not anymore. As it describes in the last sentence of the first paragraph, it says general light industrial, land use 110, and manufacturing, land use 140, are related uses. It does not say high cube warehouses. It did in the 9th edition manual 10 years ago. It no longer says that.
Okay. And which of ITE's land use categories is the best fit for what Bridge Industrial has designed, and why?
I would suggest that any of 154 through 157 land use codes, any of the high cube warehouses would be consistent with the textbook description of the warehouses based on the characteristics of the size, the ceiling heights, and the dock doors of the facility.
And why is industrial park, which Mr. Schramm pointed out could include some warehousing, not the best fit for this proposed project?
I'm going to use an analogy. So if I look at a football field and a baseball field, I can tell the difference between a football field and a baseball field. I can play football on a baseball field and I can play baseball on a football field, but it's not optimized for that use, right? And if I had a baseball complex where there's 4 baseball fields, I wouldn't call that a park. I would call that a baseball sports complex. This is 4 high cube warehouses. I would not call that an industrial park because it doesn't have any manufacturing and it doesn't have any industrial uses that look like it's possible. Now, you can do manufacturing and industrial in these types of buildings. Don't get me wrong, people do that all the time. That being said, these are optimized for high cube warehouse uses, and that is why I think it is an incorrect use to describe them as an industrial park.
Okay. I'd like to show you Exhibit A44, which is a press release from Bridge Industrial's website about the acquisition of the property at issue in this appeal.
And we'll object once again to discussion of press releases which have no actual relationship to uses in the building or the land use approval process.
Well, and here's where I'm getting hung up on this right now. You know, we're getting testimony, like, again, like, you know, I called the parties out, or one of the parties out on this earlier. We're talking about use of buildings on the property like they're happening right now, and there's nothing there right now. It's an empty field right now, and so, you know, this is all speculation based on what's been submitted at this point. This is a press release from Bridge, and unless there's some foundation for Mr. McCarthy's involvement in this press release, it's going to be just speculation again here about, you know, what Bridge did and what Bridge meant and intended. So I don't know what the foundation is here for Mr. McCarthy to be testifying about this press release. So maybe you can enlighten me there.
And Mr. Examiner, before Ms. Ty Cooper responds, because she may want to respond to this point as well, let her consolidate her responses. I would also object, this isn't a rebuttal exhibit. This was in the appellant's initial set of exhibits, and if they wanted to offer it, they could have done so, but they did not. And so I would object for that reason as well.
It is, so first, first objection first. It is relevant that Bridge Industrial is touting this facility's suitability for e-commerce uses, for logistics management, for last mile and next day delivery. That is relevant to how it is likely to be used. And it's a rebuttal exhibit because it responds directly to Mr. Schramm's testimony that all of those uses, those are not likely uses of this property.
Well,
And I don't, the fact that we gave it to to the parties a while ago, I don't think that's a basis for excluding it here.
So here's what we're gonna do. All right, if you want this admitted, made part of the record, that's fine. I think the document can speak for itself.
Okay.
Unless you've got some testimony as to Mr. McCarthy's role in the production of this document, I don't see how he's the one who's going to be getting it into the record at this point, because there's no foundation for that. If you want to admit it, I'll admit it and I'll take a look at it, and the document can speak for itself.
We're happy to admit it and let the document speak for itself. So do I need to make a motion to move it in at this point, or?
Well, that's how it's done. I've already said I'll let it in, but
yeah. Well, then here is our formal motion to move Exhibit A44 into evidence.
Ms. Kaler, did you need to make any more record in regard to it?
No, thank you, Mr. Examiner.
So A44 is admitted and made part of the record.
Okay. Dr. McCarthy, Mr. Schramm testified about other facilities for which he performed a trip generation analysis using the industrial park category that he believed were similar to the proposed Bridge Industrial project. Did you review the trip generation manual's list of studies for the industrial park category to learn more about the industrial parks that ITE studied and how they compare to the proposed facility?
I did.
And what did you learn?
There have been 3 major studies that have happened in the last 15 years. And only 3 sites were investigated. 2 of them were in Massachusetts, and a third was outside of Nevada, Reno area.
And what can you, what can you tell us about those industrial parks you studied?
Sure. So there's a Campanelli Business Park in Uxbridge, Massachusetts, which had 2 facilities as a part of it. One of them was a medical supplies distribution facility, and the second was a cannabis distribution and grow facility. So I would not consider that a warehouse land use type. And so it was a mixed use project.
And what can you tell us about the other studies?
There was a project in Taunton, Massachusetts, which was a very large, complex area. It was also identified as an industrial park. And as of the 2018 study, there was both office park, retail. There were sort of what I would consider non-commercial uses, like there was an Elks Lodge and some other facilities there that were clearly not like big, large industrial facilities. And so it was a mixed use area where there were both large distribution centers and small retail, small parts, like auto parts centers and stuff like that, in addition to those sort of small retail establishments.
And then, go ahead.
And then the third study was in Reno, and it was a mega sporting goods store. And so it was looking at what was the name of the sporting goods store? Shields All Sports. And so it was a big retail center, and that was all it was. So there's nothing else in there. It was just a big parking lot and a sporting goods complex. And so I'm not even sure how that's an industrial park at all, but that was what it was categorized as in the literature.
In your opinion, are there any significant differences between the proposed Bridge Industrial Facility and the industrial parks in these studies?
Yes. In 2 of the 3 studies, there were warehouses, but they were just one of a mixed use of facilities in the project. And the sizes of the buildings were very largely different, right? They were one large, one small. They had very big differences in terms of their characteristics. These buildings are relatively homogeneous in terms of their high cube warehouse characteristics. So that's the big differences that I see. And I see that they would be more likely to be characterized as an industrial park, although I'm not sure about the sporting goods store, why that was specifically characterized as an industrial park.
Okay, at this time, I would move Exhibit A78, which is the 2016 ITE memo, into evidence.
No objection.
All right, with no objection, A78 will be admitted.
And that is all I have for you, Dr. McCarthy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Before I turn you over for maybe some cross-examination here on this rebuttal testimony, bear with me for just a moment, and please feel free to correct me if I'm mischaracterizing, because I want to try to make sure that I've got testimony straight in my head. And that's why I rely so heavily on these recordings. After we're done and concluded, I go back and with my notes and with the recording and all that, but I got you here now. So earlier in your rebuttal testimony, you said that you've been involved in hundreds of high cube type developments, and I want to try to clarify what that involvement was. And again, if I'm mischaracterizing anything, because that's the whole point of my asking, is to make sure I've got this right. So I'm asking so you can straighten me out. You did testify that you've had involvement in hundreds of high cube warehouse developments, correct?
I would say that I have reviewed hundreds of individual permitting documents for warehouses as part of work that I've done in developing a warehouse dashboard tool that basically quantifies how many there are in Southern California.
That's why I was asking, because I thought on cross-examination on your prior testimony as part of the appellant's case in chief, you said you had not actually designed any of those. So it was always in a review function as part of putting together this dashboard tool. And was
That is correct.
Was it limited to California at that point then, or was this in other jurisdictions as well?
It includes Southern California. I have a prototype dashboard tool for Northern California, and I have, as part of those reviews, also looked at warehouse permitting documents outside of the state of California, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Washington. Most of the major port cities where containerized goods come into the US have these warehouse facilities going up in large numbers. And so I have looked at individual projects and their warehouse descriptions and their sizes just to get a comparison of what's going on nationally. I'm writing some papers on that.
Okay, so more of an academic exercise as opposed to actually designing a facility.
That is correct. I am not designing any of these facilities myself. I am simply reviewing them and quantifying how big they are and that sort of thing.
Okay, one other question for you before I turn you over possibly to Ms. Kaler here. As this project is proposed, because again, there's nothing there right now, nothing's been built yet. As it's been proposed on the site plans and the other elevations and things, the drawings that we have at this point, are there specific proposed features that would prevent these buildings from being used under what you consider to be the typical industrial park type uses? Is there anything that's prohibited with that?
So on an industrial park use, this would be sort of a mixed use facility with multiple different users and use categories. So there is nothing that is preventing that. Like I said, you can play baseball on a football field. So it is possible that these could be turned into partial manufacturing facilities or something like that. With speculative tenants, it is unclear what they could be. That being said, I would not say that is the most likely use, given that they are optimized as high cube warehouses and their proximity to the ports and the intermodal facilities nearby.
Well, isn't that kind of the bottom line then? Given that we don't know who the tenants are going to be, we just don't know at this point what it's going to be used for until we know.
I agree that we don't know, and therefore we should do an assessment of what the most likely large-scale impacts would be. That would be my conservative assumption in terms of saying, is this mitigated or not? But I am not a legal expert, and so that is simply my air quality opinion and my emissions opinion, rather than I'm not trying to make anything about what the city of Tacoma has to say or anything like that. So that's how I feel about the permitting process. The decision makers should be informed about the possible impacts of the project, and a conservative assumption should, in fact, give them a decent estimate of what the worst case scenario would be.
But out of all of those high cube uses then, some of which have lower trip generation rates than the IP designation, the industrial park, you think it's your opinion again then that the most likely use are the high cube uses that would in fact generate more trips than what the applicant study determined, correct?
Well, so I can say with certainty that if even just the biggest building, the building B, which is 950,000 square feet, was either a parcel hub or a fulfillment center sort, it would have a higher trip rate by thousands of trips if just that one was a high Q parcel. So it only has to be one of the four.
Well, yeah, but you're not really
And that's only
answering.
40% of the square footage.
So I think you answered my question by saying yes, that you're saying that the most likely use are the high cube uses that would in fact generate more trips.
I'm saying that
the ones
it's
that would be lower.
it is consistent with the location and everything else. I'm not saying it's more likely than the other uses, but if you assume that they're all equally likely high cube warehouse uses, then there's at least a 40 or 50% chance that one of these facilities will be a high cube parcel hub or fulfillment sort center. And so that is I would say that is not insignificant. I would say that is, probable. Not likely, but probable.
Yeah, I'm gonna turn you over to Ms. Kaler now. Are there questions here on cross?
Yes, thank you. Just a few. Good afternoon again, Dr. McCarthy. I have a couple questions for you to follow up on your testimony today. First, I think we'll turn to the document that has been admitted as Exhibit A78. Let me share my screen. Dr. McCarthy, I'm showing you the first page of Exhibit A78. This document was prepared in 2016, correct?
Yes.
All right.
Well, it was released 2016. They had a couple of years of prep before that, but yes.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and skip to page 14. I've highlighted, this is my highlighting, I've highlighted the first part of the first sentence in the second paragraph. Do you see the highlighted language that says the database includes one fulfillment center and one parcel hub?
I do.
And so do you understand that this study based its statements regarding fulfillment centers and parcel hubs on one of each alone?
I would disagree with that specific characterization. If you go to the set of experts that prepared this report, there's about 20 different people that prepared this report, and their experience includes more characteristics of what the warehouses are beyond the database, which was used for the trip rates specifically.
And Dr. McCarthy, can you point me to anywhere in this study that references more than one fulfillment center or more than one parcel hub on which the study's conclusions were based?
Are you willing to give me a few seconds to search the document?
Of course.
Okay. I do not believe that they say anything like that.
And so just to clarify, are you able, sitting here today, to point me to anywhere in this study that says, that refers to anything other than their data, including one fulfillment center and one parcel hub?
I am not. I am only able to point to the personnel who compiled the report as experts in warehouses, who would know what a parcel hub and fulfillment center should be characterized as.
And so the answer to my question is no, correct?
That is correct.
I'm going to return to the beginning of this document. And apologies for the scrolling through a couple pages here. I am now on PDF page 3 of the document. Do you see the statement? I've highlighted a few statements in yellow, and I'm going to ask you about the second one here in a minute, but just this first highlighted one, that the HCW market continues to evolve as individual tenants, owners implement different e-commerce business plans. Do you see that?
I do.
Okay. And it's my understanding the abbreviation HCW is High Cube Warehouse. Is that consistent with your understanding?
Yes.
Okay. Based on this statement, do you believe that the HCW market may have continued to evolve since 2016 when this study was published?
I would not have any reason to disagree with that, but I am not an economist.
Okay. So then just looking down at the next paragraph that I have highlighted, I've highlighted 2 sentences, and I'm not going to ask you to read them, but do you see the first sentence that says there's a single data point, the single data points for fulfillment centers and parcel hubs?
I do.
And the second sentence that states there are sufficient data from which to derive usable trip generation rates. Do you see that sentence?
I do, but I believe they say insufficient.
Thank you. And based on that statement, based on this study, on the face of it, is it fair to say this study is concluding that it does not have sufficient data from which to derive usable trip generation rates for those 2 particular types of high cube use?
That is correct, which is why they recommended collecting more, and they did as part of the ITE, I believe, 11th generation manual. They did collect additional for the trip rates that are currently in the 11th generation manual.
Thank you. That brings me to my next question, which really has to do with the purpose of this study. Do you see on that same page under recommendations, the first 2 sentences that I have highlighted?
I do.
And again, without asking you to read them, is it fair to say that the recommendations coming out of this study, of this document, is further study?
I wouldn't characterize it as a further study so much as there's more data needed in order to accurately have summary statistics that are reflective of the variety of these types of facilities.
So would it be fair to say that the recommendation from the study is that it needs more data?
That is correct.
I'm going to turn to page 7 of this document. And again, I've highlighted a couple things here. The highlight on the overall site layout and building dimensions, that is not mine. That was in the original document. The other highlighting is mine.
Mm-hmm.
And do you see those highlighting that for fulfillment center and parcel hub, that the parking supply ratio under fulfillment center is larger than for all other HCW types?
I do.
And similarly, higher truck parking.
I do.
For the parcel hub, again, larger employee parking ratio. You see that?
I do.
And high truck parking ratios.
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to stop sharing this for a moment. You discussed your review of permit documents for various warehouse projects. I just want to be sure that I understand the scope of that, following up on the examiner's questions. So your review of these permit documents, I believe in response to the examiner's question, you said you had reviewed hundreds of individual permitting documents. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Did you review hundreds of traffic studies, or were some of these different kinds of permitting documents?
So the documents were typically either the equivalent of an MDNS or the equivalent of an EIS. And so the documents are often thousands of pages long. And so there are many things that can be reviewed within those documents. So did I review traffic studies for hundreds of them? No, I reviewed traffic studies for probably 30 or 40. That would be, I'd say, the order of magnitude for the traffic study, because that's typically in the appendices. I typically do not review the appendices. I typically review the traffic section, which will have the trip rates and the land use categories that are assigned. So not the full trip traffic rate study.
Okay. Do you know the range in years, the times that those 30 to 40 traffic studies were prepared? Like when was the earliest prepared? Do you know?
The earliest that I've looked at, I believe, is the World Logistics Center, which was 2012 initially, although they've had a whole bunch of different revisions of it. So it had like a 2016 and a 2018. Most of them are 2018 to this year.
Okay. And did you participate personally in the preparation of any of those traffic studies?
No.
I won't repeat my questions about your prior traffic experience that I asked you before. Let's see here. I think I have a couple other questions for you. The buildings that are proposed for this project, do you know, are they up to the maximum height of this zone, or are they lower?
I do know what the building plans say.
And
they are
based on
below the maximum height for the zone.
How far below?
So the ceiling height is above 40 feet or 40 feet. I'd have to look at the exact details from the plan. It might have been 48 feet for the AFF. And then the maximum height for the zone, I believe, is 100 feet.
Okay. I have no further questions for you, Dr. McCarthy.
So redirect from the appellants.
Sure. Does the city have, maybe we already did this, no cross from the city?
City has no questions.
Okay. Dr. McCarthy, so I just want to clarify I believe you testified that you've reviewed, of the permitting documents you've looked at, there were 30 to 40 full traffic studies and an additional quantity of, let's call them decisional documents that also discuss traffic, correct?
I mean, decisional documents, is that like EIRs and MNDs and those sorts of things? Is that what you mean?
That is what I mean, yes.
Yes.
Okay. Would this facility work? You were asked about by the hearing examiner about the suitability of this proposed facility for industrial park uses. In your opinion, would this structure work as a retail space, for example, similar to the mega sporting goods store that was analyzed as an industrial park?
I don't think so, but I am not a retail space expert. But it doesn't have any of the building characteristics of a retail center. It doesn't have enough parking for retail.
Okay. And you testified that this project would produce higher traffic rates than 10W estimated if even just one building were used as a fulfillment center, sort, or parcel hub. Can you take us through those numbers, please?
Sure. So
I'm gonna object. This is not redirect. This could have been provided if the witness wanted to testify about the numbers, that could have been provided on direct. This is not a response to the questions that I just asked this witness.
This is, oh,
It does seem to be beyond the scope of the cross here, but I mean, haven't we already covered that territory?
this is follow up on one of Dr. McCarthy's responses to the hearing examiner. I'd just like to allow him to put the full response out there. And I don't think it is repetitive.
Because that isn't already in the record at this point.
I don't think so.
Let's be brief then.
So I can just quickly state that if you use the lowest possible trip rate, the high cube transload trip rate for buildings A, C, and D, which are the three smaller buildings, and the fulfillment center warehouse sort, the number of trips would be 8,283. If you use the high,
We've already done this, so I'm not sure why we're covering that ground again. We've already done this on direct back when the appellant was putting on the case. We've already talked about what the trip generation would be, so.
So okay, just to explain how it's different, Dr. McCarthy is now explaining how mixed use numbers would come out. So not all 4 buildings being analyzed as a fulfillment center, but mixed use. Mr. Schramm testified extensively about industrial park categories, industrial parks being characterized by a mix of tenants and uses. And you also.
I think we've already been down this road though.
Mr. Examiner, if this was rebuttal testimony, it should have come out in the initial rebuttal testimony. We're expanding the scope of this witness's testimity.
And
as we
there's
get
that
further.
too. I'm not really sure that it's responsive to something I asked at this point. It's going beyond. I thought I got the question answered already, so.
Okay. I'll move on. So just 2 more questions, Dr. McCarthy. The high cube warehouse market, as this memo notes, was continuing to evolve in 2016. In your experience studying high cube warehouses since 2016, is it true that fulfillment centers and parcel hubs generate higher trip rates than what 10W estimated for this project?
yes, and the ITE 11th generation manual does have additional studies that have been done since 2016 in the high cube warehouse study that we talked about.
Okay. And does ITE anywhere in this memo on high cube warehouses or the trip generation manual suggest that buildings designed to be high cube warehouses should be analyzed under the industrial park category?
No.
Okay, that's all I have.
All right, so correct me if I'm wrong then. We said before we had our break that this was the only rebuttal witness at this point from the appellants.
That's correct.
Okay. So we're done with rebuttal then, initial round. Is there sir rebuttal witnesses that need to be put on to address things that have come up in rebuttal, either from the city or from the applicant?
The applicant has no further witnesses.
City has no further witnesses.
See, sometimes it takes a little longer than others, but on these multiple day hearings, eventually you reach a point where things start to speed up. And we've hit that today. We've hit that today in a big way. So I appreciate that. And we are definitely getting done today. And I think we are done, except for just addressing logistics at this point now of how closing is going to be handled, and then a couple other questions that I have. I do want to make a disclosure, and I almost forgot about this, but I do want to make a disclosure so the parties are aware of this. It's not an ex parte contact that happened, so I'm not disclosing an ex parte contact because it wasn't by a party. I had someone who's been an observer in our participant gallery through a good part of this hearing, who looked me up on LinkedIn and sent me a message. And I just wanted to disclose that so that the parties know. It was not trying to advocate for anything one way or another. It was mostly just a comment on how I had been conducting the hearing, sort of as my my role as the MC of these proceedings, kind of thing. And that's all it was. It wasn't advocating for anything one way or another. It wasn't talking about the merits of what's going on with this. But I did want to disclose to the parties that I did get that. I had no idea that's what it was. I don't get very many messages on LinkedIn. I opened it up and saw it, and it was about that. It was it was a thoughtful message and everything, but it really wasn't anything that was trying to influence me one way or another. But I did want to disclose that had taken place. So all we have left at this point is closing. And before we address how we're going to deal with that, I do want to tell the parties that I appreciate very much your presentations. They've been well organized. They've been thoughtful. As I mentioned earlier this morning, I appreciate the fact that you've kind of been conferring with each other along the way to make sure that things were as organized as possible. And particularly with how we did things today. So I do appreciate that. Obviously, there's a lot of time and effort that's gone into the presentations of these over the course of our 5 days now. And I do recognize that. And I've got a lot of stuff to wade through on the way to making a decision. But before I do that, we do have to have closing, and we've talked about waiving oral closings and doing those in writing, and that's perfectly fine. And I think that will probably be perhaps the better way to do it in any event. And so I appreciate the party's suggestion that we go down that route. I do want to address how we're going to do that. I guess the biggest thing is timing of submissions, and it's, unless you can convince me otherwise, it's going to be just, here's the deadline for everyone, and everyone submits those at the same time. It's not going to be appellant submits their written closing brief, and then we have response and reply and all that. We're not going to do the back and forth, I don't think, unless you all have discussed it and think that we should, and you can convince me of that. But I want to talk about page limits and maybe some limits on parameters for that. So again, this is me throwing out what kind of is in my head going into this for setting parameters for closings, and I'm certainly open to being persuaded otherwise. But I would kind of like to see a general page limit. I'm not going to be completely strict on that. This isn't the Court of Appeals, and I'm not going to hand you out my formatting requirements and margins can only be this, and you have to have this much spacing and all that kind of thing. But what I don't want to see is, I don't want to see one party submit, just for purposes of illustration, 10-page closing brief, and then another party submit 100-page closing brief with a whole bunch of appendices and exhibits and all of that kind of thing. I want to kind of try to keep this on sort of a level playing field amongst the three parties. Does that make sense? And is that fair? Okay. And so to that end, I really don't want to see new things being submitted or cited in the closing briefs, unless it's a case, because I certainly account for the possibility that during the course of 5 days worth of hearing, there may have been testimony come up that no one really anticipated beforehand. And all of a sudden you go, hey, oh, there's this case out here that directly speaks to that. If there is, I want to know. And so please cite to that. But I think outside of case sites and arguing controlling case law in the context of doing your closing argument briefs, there really shouldn't be things that are outside of the record at this point that are cited and referenced to. Am I wrong in that? Okay, I see heads shaking from Ms. Kaler and Ms. Tack Cooper, and Mr. Victor just kind of looked surprised by that. I don't know. If I'm wrong on that, like I said, I'm perfectly open to be persuaded otherwise, but.
And no, city concurs.
Okay. All right. And again, with page limits, I don't want to put a specific page limit on that, but I think there should be kind of a range that we're looking at that we should try to stay within. Is that fair? And I'd love to hear from the parties as to what you think might be a reasonable target range for pages on these closing briefs. Ms. Tack Cooper, we'll hear from you first.
I was just about to open our pre-hearing brief. I can't remember exactly how long that was. I think they were in the roughly 30-page range. I'm assuming you don't want us to repeat things that were in the pre-hearing briefs. Is that right? Or do you want us to do that?
I don't need you to do that.
Okay.
And you know, it's not like high school debate was when I was coming up, where you had to make the argument at every stage of it in order for it to carry through and be considered. That's not the case here. If you made the argument in your pre-hearing briefs, I guarantee you I'll be looking at those again on the way to making the decision.
Okay.
And if something has changed significantly from your pre-hearing brief, you can point that out in your post-hearing briefs. But I don't need you to state something over again if that's still, you know, what you're arguing.
Sure. And in that case, 25 pages.
Ms. Kaler?
Well, Mr. Examiner, I guess we would be in the same general range, but would prefer 30 pages if possible. And the reason I say that is that the pre-hearing brief tends to be heavy on the law and a little bit lighter on the facts, just because none of the evidence is in. The post-hearing brief tends to be the opposite way, but sometimes it can take some pages to cite to all of the relevant portions of the record and relevant portions of the testimony. So if we could have 30 pages, that would be appreciated.
Yeah, and again, I'm not telling you I'm going to say 25 pages, and if you're over, then you know you'll be reprimanded, and I won't read past that or anything either. You know, if we said 25 and you submit 50, I'm still going to read it, but I'll be less happy about it, I suppose. Not that that makes any difference, because whether I'm happy about something or not really makes no difference as to what my decision is going to be. My decision is based on, you know, what the facts are as proved and what the law says about those facts. So I guess if we set a range of, you know, 25 to 30, and if you know, if it's 32, again, I'm not going to, you know, chop off the last 2 pages, but if we can shoot for that kind of range, I think that's certainly reasonable. Mr. Victor, are you all right with that?
That range is just fine for the city.
Okay. All right. So submittal deadline then. I know we talked about that in our pre-hearing status conference. I don't know if things have changed from that or not, but when are we anticipating we can get those in by? Ms. Tack Cooper, I'll let you go first again.
I'm just trying to find my notes on the date we said before. I believe it was August 21st.
Yeah, I had
Okay.
August 21st stuck in my mind too, but I can't find my notepad for that either. So
That would still work for us.
you're still good with that, Ms. Kaler?
Yes, we are still good with that.
Okay.
I would like to raise it or make a suggestion, I guess, raise a question
Sure.
about the order of briefing. I think we do think that simultaneous briefing is appropriate, At the same time, I will say in appellant's opening brief, there were a couple things that we would not have anticipated based on the prior filings. And I think that's always a possibility, right? Because folks look at things in different ways. And since we are the responding party, we do want to have the opportunity to respond. What we have done in some other cases is to do a simultaneous post-hearing brief and then a much shorter opportunity for simultaneous response, say, 5 pages a few days later. And that just allows the parties, if there was anything really surprising in the other party's brief, to respond without generating a whole opening response reply briefing cycle.
Well, let me say this about that. I'm not closing the door on that, but I'm not going to say at this moment in time that we definitely will be doing that. What I would like to do with that is we get things submitted on the 21st. Everybody reads over them all while I'm reading over them, and if the parties feel like there's a really strong need for that kind of a response additional round, you can make your case for that at that point. Is that okay?
Thank you.
All right. Okay. So August 21st it is. What day of the week is that? Pull up my calendar here really fast.
Mr. Examiner, can I ask a couple clarifying questions?
Certainly.
So in terms of if any party does feel a burning need for a short rebuttal brief, what would be the process and timeline for requesting that? We wouldn't want to go through a whole motion cycle again on asking for a short rebuttal brief. Can that be asked for via email?
Yes.
Thank
Yes,
you.
but I do want you to make the case for it. Don't just say, hey, we want it. Tell me why. Because I don't want to just say as a matter of course we're gonna do that. Tell me why that's necessary. It can be in an email. You all have my office's email address, and send it in with that. And I would like those requests to be within 3 business days of the 21st. If we can do that. So I had my calendar and then I just threw it back behind things. So let's see. I close of business the 24th. That would be the deadline to request additional response briefing. Does that work?
That certainly works. And then only one other small question, which is whether when we're citing testimony, is it workable for the examiner if we cite to a timestamp on a certain day from either the video or audio recording? That would be typically how we would want to do it, but I'm just checking to confirm that that will work.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic if you included that. And that'll help me head it down a whole lot sooner.
Thank you.
Do you have a preference as to whether we cite the audio versus the video?
Yes, actually. I would much prefer the video, because that's since we started doing this back at the outset of the pandemic, and I've had video in addition to audio. I much prefer to go back through the video than I do the audio. I hope that isn't throwing a wrench in the works for you. I know you guys have all been working off the just straight digital audio that we've been sending out at the end of each day, but and in case it helps, I don't know. I think we've been sending out links to the Zoom video to the parties as well, but last week sometime we got what in effect ends up becoming a public disclosure request under the State Public Records Act for the video. And so my office has had, I guess I'll call it a rogue YouTube site for a while. Long story there. asked the city to be able to do it, got ignored for a long time, and so I just did it myself. We've been posting the video from the hearing, and we've got it up through day 4 on my City of Tacoma Hearing Examiner website. And the video for today will be up there probably sometime tonight as well. At some point now, because the city's aware of my rogue site, they're going to move it all over to the city's YouTube location, but it hasn't been moved there yet. And so until it is, it'll be on that. Really easy to find. Just go on YouTube and search for City of Tacoma Hearing Examiner, and it'll take you right to us. So. Anything else?
Nothing from the appellants.
And nothing from the applicant?
And nothing from the city.
All right. Well, again, I thank you for your presentations. Lots for me to do still. At least a little bit for you all to do still too, with the closing briefs and everything. And I will look forward to getting those on the 21st. And we'll see if we need to do another round. And at some point after that, we will have a decision. I will note that unless there's a compelling reason for me to print it out and mail it to you, we've been doing things electronically since even before the pandemic. So that's how we like to do it, is we scan the decision once it's done and signed, send that out to the parties as a PDF scan. That would be the way that we would intend to send it out, unless you can convince me that I really need to mail it to you. Fewer impacts that way, less paper, all that kind of thing. So that's how that will be done. And again, thank you for your presentations, and I will wish you a good rest of your day. And with that, the formal part of the hearing will be concluded. The record, in terms of the evidentiary record, will be closed at this point because nobody's talked about keeping it open for anything. I will note that the post-hearing briefing is part of the record, but not from an evidentiary standpoint. And I think council all understands that, but just so those who are listening understand that as well. And with that, I'll wish you a good rest of your day, and we will be concluded. Thank you.
Thank you.